April 1973. Federal Express had $5,000 left in its bank account. Not $5 million. Not $500,000. $5,000, enough to cover roughly one day of jet fuel costs, nothing more. Fred Smith, the founder, the dreamer, the 28-year-old Yale graduate who had staked his family inheritance on an idea that the entire banking world had called delusional, looked at that number and understood exactly what it meant. Monday was coming. And Monday meant payroll. So what does a man do when the machine he built is about to swallow its last breath? Federal Express was born from a thesis. Literally. In 1965, Fred Smith had written a paper at Yale arguing that the United States desperately needed a dedicated overnight air freight network, a system designed from scratch to move packages fast, not as an afterthought bolted onto passenger airline routes. His professor reportedly gave it a C. Smith kept the idea anyway. After Vietnam, where Smith flew 200 combat missions and came home decorated, he came back to that thesis with serious money and serious conviction. He purchased an existing aviation company called Arkansas Aviation Sales in 1969, used it as a foundation, and began building what he called Federal Express Corporation, incorporated in June 1971 in Little Rock, Arkansas. The concept was elegant. All packages would fly into a single central hub in Memphis, Tennessee, get sorted overnight, then fan out to their destinations before morning. Memphis was chosen for its geography, near the population center of the country, and for its weather, which was more reliable than most. Smith raised $91 million in startup capital, a staggering sum for the era, pulling in backers including General Dynamics and Newcourt Securities. Federal Express launched its first flights on April 17, 1973. 14 small Dassault Falcon jets. 18 cities. That first night, the entire network moved exactly 186 packages. The company needed to move thousands per night just to approach financial viability. The losses piled up with terrifying speed. Jet fuel costs exploded when OPEC's oil embargo struck in October 1973. Banks began calling. Investors grew cold. Smith went back to his backers again and again, and again and again they hesitated or refused. The company was bleeding roughly $1 million a month. And then came the decision that changed everything. The specific week is not recorded with forensic precision, but the core facts have been confirmed by Fred Smith himself in multiple interviews and by Federal Express Company historians. It was late in the spring of 1973, some accounts place it as early as April, others in the weeks that immediately followed the April 17 launch. What is not disputed is the number. Federal Express had approximately $5,000 remaining in its operating account. The fuel suppliers needed payment. The employees needed their wages. General Dynamics, one of the company's primary backers, had just refused, again, to release additional investment funds. A meeting with the board had gone nowhere. Smith flew home to Memphis and sat with the reality: Monday was coming, and there was no payroll. There is a detail here worth pausing on. Fred Smith had already mortgaged his personal inheritance, somewhere between $8 and $9 million of his own family money, to keep the company alive at various points in its earliest years. That money was gone. His investors were out of patience. The banks had already extended credit past the point of comfort. He had made every call there was to make to every person who might conceivably write a check. The answer was no. The answer was always no. So Fred Smith did not call a lawyer. He did not file for Chapter 11. He did not call his board together and weep into a conference table. According to his own recollection, he simply decided, with a clarity that sounds either insane or deeply sane depending on your disposition, to fly to Las Vegas. He took the company's last $5,000, boarded a plane, and went to the blackjack tables. He won $27,000. He flew back to Memphis. He deposited the money. Federal Express made payroll on Monday. Now, Fred Smith himself has told this story with a kind of amused, rueful candor that suggests even he understood the absurdity. What difference did it make, he reportedly told biographer Vance Trimble. It was either this, or the company was done. $27,000 was not enough to save Federal Express. It was barely enough to make one payroll cycle. But it bought something more valuable than money. It bought 72 hours. And 72 hours, it turned out, was exactly what was needed to keep the conversations alive, to get back on the phone Monday morning with enough breath in the company's lungs to make one more case to one more investor. The $27,000 did not save Federal Express. The belief behind the act did. The 72 hours bought by that blackjack table did not solve the existential problem. Let's be honest about that. After that weekend, Federal Express was still a company in catastrophic financial distress. The fuel crisis was still real. The losses were still mounting. General Dynamics was still unmoved. Smith still faced the same investors, the same creditors, the same brutal arithmetic. What followed was not a miracle. It was months of grueling, grinding negotiation. In the summer and fall of 1973, Smith made desperate runs at new capital. He approached venture firms. He approached freight industry veterans. He pitched, argued, pleaded, and cajoled. His own legal team, deeply alarmed by the company's trajectory, reportedly suggested that Smith had been making misleading statements to General Dynamics about the use of funds, an allegation that led, in 1975, to Smith being indicted on fraud charges related to a different transaction involving a bank loan in which he allegedly forged his sister's signatures to secure additional capital for the company. Smith was ultimately acquitted. But the episode illustrates the human cost of the pressure he was operating under. The lines he may have crossed. The corners a man cuts when he believes completely that he is right and the world is simply too slow to see it. The employees who stayed through 1973 stayed without certainty. Many had joined Federal Express out of belief, young pilots, mechanics, and operations staff who accepted below-market wages because Smith's vision was electric. Some left. Some stayed and were rewarded beyond imagination. When Federal Express went public in April 1978, and then began its long climb toward dominance, those early employees who held stock options became wealthy. A few became very wealthy. Fred Smith himself became a billionaire. The company he nearly lost in a Vegas casino eventually employed over 400,000 people worldwide and processed millions of packages every single night. But the people who said no in 1973, the General Dynamics executives, the bank officers who refused to extend credit one more week, they walked away from one of the most valuable logistics companies in American history. That is its own kind of consequence. Not a punishment. Just the cold arithmetic of doubt. What this story is really about is not gambling. That framing, Fred Smith won at blackjack and saved his company, is seductive, but it's a little dangerous if you accept it at face value. The Vegas trip was not a strategy. It was a symptom. It was what happens at the absolute edge of rational options, when a person has exhausted every conventional move and still cannot bring themselves to stop believing. What Fred Smith had in April 1973 was not luck. It was a species of conviction so intense it functioned almost like a different kind of intelligence. He saw something real, the world genuinely did need overnight package delivery, and he was genuinely right about how to build it, and he refused to let the inability of other people to see it kill the idea. That stubbornness is admirable. It is also, it must be said, something that destroys far more people than it saves. For every Fred Smith who flies to Vegas and wins $27,000 in lives to see his company go public at a valuation of hundreds of millions of dollars, there are 100 founders who fly to Vegas and come home with nothing and file for bankruptcy on Tuesday. The outcome is not the measure of whether the act was wise. The outcome is just the outcome. What the story actually teaches is something more uncomfortable. The banking system, the investor class, the people charged with evaluating risk and allocating capital, they were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Catastrophically, expensively, historically wrong. Federal Express went on to generate billions of dollars in economic value, to reshape global commerce, to make possible the modern era of e-commerce. And the people sitting across the table from Fred Smith in 1973 said no. Capital does not flow to the best ideas. It flows to the ideas that look, in the moment, most like the ideas that already worked. Fred Smith had the right idea. He nearly had to gamble it into existence. The scariest part is how many right ideas didn't make it to Monday.